Good afternoon. I think we'll get started. I'm Michael Rothberg, faculty member in English and Comparative Literature and Jewish Studies and the 1939 Society Samuel Getz Chair in Holocaust Studies. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture with Professor Sarah Phillips Casteel, which has been organized by the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And today, Professor Casteel is going to be presenting her recent book, Black Lives Under Nazism, Making History Visible in Literature and Art. And after Sarah speaks for about 30 minutes about her book, she's going to be in conversation with Ben Ratzkoff. So my job, it will be in one moment to introduce Ben Ratzkoff, who will then introduce Sarah Casteel, and then Sarah will come up and speak. So this program is our annual Cannes Book Talk in German Jewish Studies, and we'll have copies available for purchase after the event. I want to thank the wonderful Levy Center staff, as always, for making our events possible. And I want to thank you for joining us and ask you to please take a moment to silence your phone. So today's moderator and conversation partner is going to be Ben Ratzkoff, who is an assistant professor of critical theory and social justice at Occidental College. His research interrogates the politics of Holocaust memory and representation and the theoretical, cultural, and historical relationship between anti-Semitism, colonialism, and white supremacy. He's published in journals including Jewish Studies Quarterly, Studies in American Jewish Literature, and the Journal of Genocide Research, where his essay just won a prize. And his current book project examines how Black writers and intellectuals in the US, French Empire, South Africa, and the Third Reich represented Nazi anti-Semitism in real time. So it's my pleasure to hand things over to Ben Ratzkoff.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here today. I was Professor Rothberg's student some years ago. So I have the wonderful job of introducing my colleague, Sarah Casteel. Sarah Casteel is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a professor of English at Carleton University, where she is cross-appointed to the Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture and the Institute of African Studies. The author of 3 monographs and co-editor of 3 essay collections, her books include Black Lives Under Nazism, Making History Visible in Literature and Art, as well as Calypso Jews, Jewishness in the Caribbean Literary Imagination. She has held the Potsdam Postcolonial Chair for Global Modernities at the University of Potsdam, a visiting professorship at the University of Vienna, and visiting fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Zentrum Jüdische Studien Berlin-Brandenburg, the recipient of a Canadian Jewish Literary Award and a Polanyi Prize. She is a member of the Academic Council of the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University. Please.
Well, thank you very much to the Levy Center for the kind invitation. I'm really glad to be back here. And Michael was reminding me that it was at the last time I was here, I think was 2019. I was at early stages of this project, and I really appreciate the support that the Levy Center has given to the kind of Jewish studies work that I've been trying to do. Thank you to Michael and to Ben for so kindly hosting and introducing me. I want to begin by acknowledging that I come to the topic of Black experience in wartime Europe as an outsider to Black culture. One of the most enriching aspects of the research process for this book was that it brought me into contact with a number of the artists and writers I was studying and their descendants. I'm deeply indebted to these individuals, and especially to the Nassy family, for their trust and for supporting my efforts to trace little-known Black wartime stories. At the same time, I also want to start by acknowledging that my approach to this book was shaped by my own Eastern European Jewish family's history of persecution during the Holocaust, a history that proved to be more proximate to that of my research subjects than I had originally anticipated. One branch of my family came from a small town near the city of Lvov, Poland, now Lviv, Ukraine. Lvov was also home to the Polish Jewish artist Max Brandel. During the war, Brandel would be imprisoned in an internment camp in Nazi Germany alongside a painter from the Dutch Caribbean named Josef Nassy. While interned, Brandel drew caricatures of Nassy and other black prisoners in the camp, as you see on the right side, his caricature of the artist Josef Nassy, just as Nassy himself portrayed some of the Jewish prisoners, as we see on the left side. So my book draws inspiration from these and other artists and writers' relational, or in Michael Rothberg's terms, multi-directional perspectives on Black and Jewish experiences of Nazi persecution. And I'm quite interested in this idea of these two artists encountering each other and drawing each other within the context of the internment camp. So what I'd like to do in about 30 minutes today in my talk is to give you a sense of how the artworks I address in the book, I think, reframe our understanding of the Holocaust by revealing its entanglements with colonial histories of violence. I'll also reflect briefly on how the resonances of the relational perspectives that these artworks promote have shifted as a result of world events that unfolded during and after the writing of this book. In August 2023, 2 Holocaust memorial stones were installed in Berlin's Prenzlauer Berg neighborhood. They join the more than 100,000 other Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, that have been laid since the mid-1990s in Germany and across Europe in front of former residences of victims of the Third Reich. These 2 stones were distinctive, however, in commemorating individuals of African descent: the Cameroonian actor Ludwig Mbebe Mpessa and his wife Erika Mpessa, whose father was a colonial migrant from Cameroon who came to Germany in 1891. The first Stolperstein dedicated to a Black victim was installed in Berlin's Mitte district in 2007 in memory of Majub bin Adam Mohammed, a colonial soldier and film actor from Tanzania who perished at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1944. Over the past several years, further stones have been laid for Black victims who perished at Ravensbrück, the Bernburg T4 killing center, and elsewhere. Along with other recent memorialization projects, such as France's call to rename French streets after African and Caribbean Allied soldiers, the dedication of these Stolpersteine marks the emergence of a public recognition of Black people as being among both Hitler's victims and Europe's liberators. And I mentioned the dates when these Stolpersteine were installed, partly to suggest how recent it is that this memory has kind of entered into the public sphere. Long before the installation of these memorial stones, however, Black victims of Nazi persecution had documented their experiences in their wartime artwork and post-war testimonies. Moreover, starting in the late 1980s, a younger generation of Black writers and artists began to imaginatively recover these victims' stories through the mnemonic mediums of literature and visual art. And what I'm trying to visualize for you on the slide there is the corpus that I assembled in the course of researching and writing this book, which I think of as a kind of alternative archive of Holocaust memory and wartime memory, both testimonial works and imaginative works. While the appearance of many of the post-memorial artworks coincided with the Holocaust memory boom of the late 20th century, for the most part they did not gain much traction, nor did they find a place in canons of Holocaust literature and art. Instead, they anticipated a shift in memory culture that is only now underway, catalyzed in the public sphere by Black European activism and the Black Lives Matter movement, and in academia by the growth of Black European studies and by the colonial turn in Holocaust studies. While I was at the later stages of working on the book, the murder of George Floyd and the global protests that followed precipitated a shift in public consciousness that promoted not only a re-examination of the present, but also of overlooked Black histories. And one marker of this shift, among many, was the launching in 2023 of a new series in which my book appeared, Black Lives in the Diaspora, Past, Present, and Future, which is a collaboration between Columbia University Press and Howard University. Another marker of this shift in consciousness was the impact it had on the fields of Jewish studies and Holocaust studies, which responded to this moment by devoting increased attention to race and colonialism and to the insights opened up by comparative frameworks and connective frameworks. Post-October 7th, however, reassertions of an exceptionalist understanding of the Holocaust have threatened to shut this space down again, which I think makes the relational perspective that the artworks I examine makes that perspective all the more urgent. So probing the boundaries of Holocaust art and memory, my book identifies a largely unrecognized corpus of literature and visual art that addresses Black experiences in wartime Europe. This corpus and its often ambivalent reception reveal how entrenched categories of art and victimhood can obstruct our access to the past and obscure connections among histories, identities, and aesthetic traditions that conventionally have been perceived as separate. And I want to emphasize that while these works draw attention to a neglected past, my interest as a cultural critic lies less in securing historical facts than in understanding how artworks produce, reshape, and circulate memory. The works I examine illustrate that art operates not only as a vehicle, but also as an agent of memory. Challenging the erasure of Black wartime histories, they serve as a counterweight to hegemonic narratives of the past. And although I'm not a historian, I will just give you sort of a quick bit of historical context because I think it's sort of necessary for this, the topic of this book. So unlike Jews and the Roma and Sinti, people of African descent were not systematically targeted by the Nazis for elimination. Nonetheless, they suffered a variety of forms of persecution during the Nazi period, including ostracization, forced sterilization, incarceration in labor, internment, and concentration camps, medical experimentation, and death. As the biographies of the Black victims commemorated by Stolpersteiner attest, this small population was very diverse. It included Black Europeans, many of whom were of dual African and European heritage, African, Caribbean, and African American expatriates who traveled to Europe in search of educational and employment opportunities, and colonial soldiers. Among the African American emigres were a number of jazz musicians who chose to stay in Europe when the war broke out rather than return to the segregated American society that they had sought to escape. Others who fell victim to the Nazi regime included African POWs, such as the Senegalese writer and statesman Léopold Sédar Senghor, who's pictured at the top left, members of the resistance, such as the Surinamese anti-colonial thinker Antoine de Kom, who's in the middle on the left, and Congolese Dachau prisoner Jean Vosté, who may or may not be the individual in the larger image on the right. And if you like, during the Q&A, I can tell you more about the complexities around that photograph. And then finally, children of former German colonial subjects, such as the Black German memoirist Theodor Michael, who's on the bottom left. The experiences of this victim group remain a largely untold chapter in the history of World War II. The central problem confronted by the artworks I examine is the invisibility, or we could say the invisibilization, of Black wartime experiences. This invisibility does not simply bespeak a casual disregard for Black history, but rather an active and systematic practice of disavowal. And I think a particularly vivid illustration of this practice was the deliberate removal of colonial soldiers from the unit that liberated Paris in August 1944, this practice of whitewashing the French army, which apparently was really under pressure from the Americans, who still had segregation within the troops at that time. So while 2/3 of the Free French forces were African, the Allied High Command insisted that Paris must be seen to be liberated by white soldiers. As this example of the visual excision of colonial troops from the European theater of war attests, history is not simply a fixed reality. Instead, as the Haitian scholar Michel Roth-Trouillot emphasizes, history is both a social process and a narrative of the past that expresses our relationship to historical knowledge. Accordingly, every historical narrative is attended to what Trouillot describes as a particular bundle of silences, silences that reflect the relations of power and present conditions in which that narrative is produced. Notably, inherent in the processual and unfixed character of historical knowledge is the potential for new counter-hegemonic narratives of the past to emerge. So the central argument really of my book is that Black writing and visual art play a key role in the production of these counter-narratives. And they do so, I think, by introducing unfamiliar images of World War II and the Holocaust in which European and African diaspora histories emerge as deeply intertwined. So what I'd like to do now is to offer briefly 3 examples that I look at in the book that demonstrate this counter-memorial function of art in the context of Black wartime history. I'll start with paintings produced during the war and then turn to post-memorial works of fiction and photomontage that imaginatively reconstruct wartime experiences. Attesting to art's role as an agent of historical memory, it was actually my encounter with the first 2 examples that I'll share with you that led me to write this book. Ultimately, however, I'll argue that the artworks don't so much supply the viewer or the reader with historical facts as engender what the historian Jana Brown calls a state of creative mourning. So, first example, and this one I'll go into the most depth with because it's really the set of works that's at the heart of the book. Buried in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's storage facility in suburban Washington are a series of drawings and paintings by Josef Nassy, a little-known Caribbean artist of African and Sephardic Jewish descent. They were created between 1942 and 45 while Nassy was interned in Bavaria alongside a number of other Black prisoners. The Josef Nassy collection, which has not been exhibited since 1997, is to my knowledge the most substantial visual record of Black prisoners in the Nazi camp system. With its encoded and compressed character, the collection records Black wartime perspectives that remain unarticulated in textual records of the camps. Nassy's biography exhibits a pattern of emancipatory emigration and self-invention that also characterizes many of the other figures of African descent I encountered in my research. After spending his early years in the Dutch Caribbean colony of Suriname, where he was born in 1904, Nassy moved in 1918 to New York City, where he attended high school and earned a degree in electrical engineering. Much like a number of African Americans during the interwar years, Nassy eventually sought greater freedom and prospects through emigration to Europe. The opportunity came in 1929 when he was sent to England to install sound systems for the first talking movies. In 1931, he settled in Brussels, where he married a Belgian woman and studied painting at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Paradoxically, Nassy's emancipatory migration to Europe exposed him to a different regime of racial oppression that took hold with the rise of the Third Reich. Following the German occupation of Belgium and the entry of the United States into the war, Nassy was arrested as an enemy alien in April 1942. After being held in a transit camp in Belgium, he was transferred for the duration of the war to 2 civilian POW camps, Ilag 7 in Laufen, Bavaria, and its subcamp in the neighboring village of Tittmoning. While it may seem counterintuitive, Nassy was arrested neither because of his skin color nor because of his Jewish ancestry, but because of his citizenship. When he had immigrated to Europe, he had falsely claimed to be an American by changing his place in his date of birth, an act of self-reinvention that would profoundly shape his wartime experience. Thanks to his falsified U.S. citizenship, Nassy was interned as an Allied prisoner and granted the protections of the Geneva Convention. And I think, sort of paradoxically, it was really this falsification of his citizenship that resulted in him having, I think he would have had a much worse experience during the war if he had not taken that step. And I think that because when I look at what happened to other Dutch colonial subjects who were arrested and imprisoned, they end up in much worse places and sometimes are murdered. So it was fortuitous for him that he had this false U.S. passport. So he's granted the protections of the Geneva Convention as an Allied prisoner, and the International YMCA, as a result of that, supplied the internment camp with art materials that enabled Nassy to produce over 200 drawings and paintings, comprising interior and exterior scenes, as well as portraits in pencil, ink, and oil paint. The work's muted palette, bleak imagery, and stark composition convey the loneliness, anxiety, and deprivations of daily life in Nazi civilian POW camps. The psychological challenges of internment find their deepest expression in Nassy's moving portraits of his fellow prisoners. As you can see, there are many of these portraits. In keeping with other art created in the Nazi camp system, the genre that dominates the collection is portraiture. Somewhat atypically for internment portraiture, however, Nassy does not include any textual information identifying his subjects, and I'll return to that point later, but you'll see his artist signature is usually present, but not the names or other, the prisoner number or other identifying material. Nassy's portraits are also unusual in that many of them portray black prisoners, 16 of whom were interned alongside him in Elag 7. While most of these men were African American entertainers, one was a West African who had been in the British Navy. So Nassy, in other words, leaves us this unique visual record of the presence of these black prisoners in the Nazi camp system, a presence that's largely not traceable in the written records. In one of his most complex oil compositions, Nassy portrays 9 black prisoners in their cramped barracks in Titmoning Castle in 1943. Here, the thick application of paint and gray and brown tones generate an atmosphere of airless enclosure. In the background, one prisoner faces away from the viewer at a silent piano, while 4 others sit or lie in their bunks. In the foreground, 3 seated figures are occupied with preparing or eating food and playing the guitar. Meanwhile, a 4th prisoner stares out at the viewer, his raised eyebrows and direct gaze inviting us to engage with and witness the scene. Head tilted to one side, right hand resting on his knee, shoulders slumped and legs splayed, he appears resigned to his fate, his passive pose conveying the despair and helplessness of his situation. In the upper left-hand corner of the canvas, we see what I believe to be Nassy himself at work at an easel while perched on his bunk. This embedded self-portrait signals how, as an imprisoned artist, Nassy reclaimed some degree of agency and control by organizing the visual elements that make up this scene of disempowerment. Nassy's portraits of black internees communicate in a concentrated fashion possible only through a visual medium, the prisoner's psychological and material predicament. Moreover, they demonstrate the particular capacity of painting and drawing to document a hyper-visible prisoner population that nonetheless has remained hidden from view in the collective memory of World War II. At the same time, Nassy's omission of the names of the black prisoners from their portraits paradoxically reinscribes their anonymity, signaling, perhaps we could say, the impossibility of rendering transparent a wartime experience that has gone largely unrecorded. Frustrating the viewers' or researchers' desire to ascertain the identities of these prisoners, Nassy instead offers us a different order of historical knowledge by communicating emotional and psychological truths of black civilian internment that are unavailable elsewhere in the archive. Okay, so I'm turning now to the second example. Beginning in the late 1980s, black wartime stories such as that of Josef Nassy and the jazz musicians with whom he was imprisoned inspired a number of works of fiction by African diaspora writers who had not themselves experienced Nazi persecution. The plots of these novels hinge on the discovery of a testimonial object, such as a diary, that provides an opening for memory. By exhibiting these fictionalized artifacts, the novels compensate for gaps in World War II archives, much as novels about slavery supply the voices of enslaved people that are missing from the colonial archive. So turning now from image to text and from testimonial art to post-war imaginative reconstruction, I'll briefly discuss one such work, Ghanaian-Canadian writer S.C. Adujan's novel Half-Blood Blues from 2011. Combining Holocaust fiction's documentary effect with jazz fiction's polyvocality, Adujan's novel imaginatively excavates the forgotten wartime stories of both Black Germans and African American entertainers who were working in Europe when the war broke out. In so doing, Half-Blood Blues illustrates the capacity of jazz fiction to produce revisionary wartime narratives. Yet resisting the testimonial mode in favor of a nonlinear and heavily mediated narrative structure, Adujan's novel destabilizes the realist project of historical recovery. In Half-Blood Blues, young American and European jazz musicians in interwar Berlin form a band called the Hot Time Swingers. The band's black German trumpet player is one of the Rhineland children who were born to white German mothers and French colonial troops who were stationed in the occupied Rhineland after World War I. This population was perceived by the Nazis as a Jewish orchestrated threat of racial contamination to the Volksgemeinschaft, or national body, and was subjected to forced sterilization in the 1930s. So in Duggin's replaying of this historical episode, the band's black German trumpeter, after fleeing Germany, he's arrested in occupied Paris in 1940 and imprisoned in the Mauthausen concentration camp. Moving between the wartime years and the early 1990s, Half-Blood Blues traces the efforts of his bandmates, musicologists, and documentary filmmakers to determine what happened to him after his deportation. Oscillating between different historical moments and circling back to key episodes like a record that keeps turning in its grooves, Duggin's novel invites the reader to consider how memories of the past are continually reshaped according to the needs of the present. The novel thus exemplifies the capacity of literary discourse, identified by Astrid Earle and other scholars, to not only circulate memory, but to reflect on its production. But I think quite strikingly, while appearing to build towards the black German protagonist's firsthand account of his imprisonment in Mauthausen, I think we're sort of, as we read the novel, we're waiting for this kind of testimony to come. In the end, Duggin's novel withholds his concentration camp testimony from the reader, thereby defying our desire to fill this gap in the archive. A still more profound challenge to the project of historiographic and archival repair, however, is issued by the photomontage series that I'll offer as the third and final example. How does one visualize an invisible history? This is the central question that animated the late Scottish Ghanaian artist and writer Maud Salter's work, and in particular her 1993 photomontage series, Circus, which is the word for circus in Welsh. Inspired by Weimar photographer August Sander's photographs of black circus workers and influenced by the collages of Dada artist Hannah Höch, Salter's eerie photomontages visually evoke both ethnographic object photography and Nazi landscape aesthetics to unsettle assumptions about the relationship of black people to European history. Read alongside its companion poem, Blood Money, Circus is particularly striking for its refusal of portraiture and realist modes of representation. Salter's haunting alpine scenes evoke black European wartime histories, even as they simultaneously call into question the capacity of art to recover these histories. Salter conceived of this photomontage series Circus as the pages of a scrapbook of a fictional black German girl named Helga, who is also the subject of her prose poem, Blood Money. So when the works have been exhibited, the poem is exhibited alongside them. In the poem, we learn that Helga is the daughter of a Cameroonian circus performer and a black German man. After the Nazis come to power, Helga's father, Kwesi, is imprisoned in a concentration camp while she is subjected to forced sterilization. And I quote from the poem, "For the child of the circus, there would be no reparation for a sterilized womb, family torn apart, incarcerated, enforced labor, concentration camp internment, leading for Kwesi to death with the gypsies and Jews and gays and the others." Helga's family's story, as it's relayed in the form of this poem, condenses the history of African colonial subjects' immigration to Europe and the fate that they and their descendants suffered under the Nazis. Countering Holocaust exceptionalism, the poem concludes by situating this untold wartime history as part of a series of holocausts ranging from slavery, the witch trials, and pogroms to the Bosnian genocide of the early 1990s. The poem's refrain is, "Close your eyes and imagine a German." Repeated 4 times, this refrain problematizes constructions of German identity and history that erase black presences. Moreover, the speaker suggests that the traumatic experiences of black people under the Nazis cannot be addressed through traditional verse form, remarking towards the end of the poem, quote, "There's no way I can make this poem rhyme," unquote. Instead, the poem's division into verse paragraphs without line breaks brings it closer to prose. At the same time, by employing poetic devices such as compression and repetition, Salter resists the linear emplotment and narrative closure that characterize fiction and narrative history. Still more resistant to narrativizing the past are the photomontages themselves, which, unlike their companion poem, do not offer a portrait of the black German girl Helga or of her Cameroonian mother. And I've been really struck by the decision that Seltzer makes, because her practice is one, as I'll talk about, of sort of cutting and pasting and montaging. She doesn't use, I'll just go back for a moment, she doesn't use the Zander photographs where you see some of these black figures, circus workers that he captures in those images. She could have taken those figures and montaged them into the photomontages, but she doesn't do that, and I find that to be an interesting choice. And instead, what we see is that she uses these ethnographic photographs, and I'll say more about them in a moment. So instead, by pairing the photomontages with the poem, Seltzer indirectly implies Helga's presence as the creator of the scrapbook whose pages make up the images in Circus. So in other words, this fictional black German girl who's described in the poem is meant to be the creator of these images, which are part of this her scrapbook. The source of the object photographs is Frank Willett's book, African Art, from the Thames and Hudson World of Art series. Reappropriating Willett's images, Seltzer mounts the black and white photographs on an old album of postcards featuring touristic alpine scenes. These jarring juxtapositions visually comment on the decontextualizing discourse of ethnographic photography and on the circulation in Europe of African objects obtained through colonial theft. Simultaneously, Seltzer's choice of backdrop alludes to the Nazis' encoding of the Alps as an Aryan landscape and suggests the capacity of the picturesque to mask violence, as I'm suggesting by showing the photograph of Hitler's Bavarian retreat. So the strange combination of these two kind of different registers of imagery is what I think is really the point, in a way, of the photomontages. If we find this juxtaposition of the ethnographic photographs of the African carved objects and then the alpine landscape strange, why is it that we find them strange, and what does that suggest about our way of seeing? I'll just go back, yeah. In Circus, Helga and the black circus workers photographed by August Zander haunt the alpine landscapes displayed in the photomontages but do not appear within them. Instead, the substitution of African carved objects for human figures and the genre of ethnographic photography for portraiture suggest that the history of black people in early and mid-20th century Europe is not readily retrievable. While Seltzer alludes to an African diaspora presence in wartime Europe, she does not attempt to reconstruct that presence, which is available only through the problematic mediation of ethnographic photography. Ultimately, then, Seltzer is less interested, I think, in recovering a forgotten past than in reflecting on the ways of seeing and the structures of power that have prevented its apprehension. Her assemblages juxtapose two seemingly unrelated modes of visual representation, the picturesque and ethnographic art photography, that emerge as mutually implicated in an imperial gaze. Bringing alpine idols and ethnographic imagery into the same visual plane, Seltzer exposes their common capacity for erasure and the power of landscape representation to naturalize certain identities at the expense of others. And I'll just very briefly wrap up here. In 2020, a blog post by London's Wiener Holocaust Library, entitled The Persecution of Black People in the Nazi Camp System, published in response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, elicited several comments that exposed a gap in the memorialization of World War II. In a comment posted in April 2023, one reader asked pointedly, quote, "Why isn't this in most libraries or more commonly known?" A sentiment that was echoed by another reader a few months later who wrote, "Why isn't this common knowledge?" A third reader comment posted in January 2024 was still more emphatic. "This is shocking. Why is this history not better known? Where are the books, films, studies?" As my book shows, the pattern of erasure and forgetting that these readers are so shocked by created an opening for Black writers and visual artists to intervene into public memory culture. Through acts of testimony, memorialization, and imagination, they have sought to reframe our understanding of World War II and the Holocaust to incorporate Black perspectives and to uncover connections with colonial histories of violence. These works of literature and visual art attest that with its creative license and mnemonic staying power, art has a key role to play in reorienting our understanding of the past. Yet what exactly is the nature of these writers' and artists' interventions into collective memory? I would suggest that they are engaged not only in a project of recovery, but also in a project of disruption, to borrow Tina Camp's distinction. They make us simultaneously aware of our desire to recover a marginalized wartime history, to make it visible, and of the impossibility of redeeming a past that has been systematically erased. Inhabiting this tension between recovery and disruption, the artworks I discuss open up an imaginative space in which to mourn a victim group whose stories will never be fully known. In so doing, they also, importantly, I think, encourage a relational understanding of different histories of racism and violence that seems to me to be even more urgent today in our current moment of rising xenophobia and polarization. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Just a few, really, of the works that you explore in the book. And you know, as somebody who has a overlapping research interests, I mean, even myself, I found myself surprised to learn so many of the things that I still hadn't read about, or newspaper articles from the 40s even that I hadn't encountered yet, and it's so rich. I wanted to start by asking you, so in the introduction, you described this archive that you've assembled of Black experiences under Nazism as both invisible and invented. And the book really does powerfully show how artistic and literary works can recover these experiences, and that these works also sort of sometimes problematically, sometimes creatively blur the boundaries between fact and fiction. I was wondering if you could speak more about that tension, and perhaps how it relates to broader discussions in both Holocaust studies and Black studies. For example, debates on memory versus history in Holocaust studies, especially around Holocaust testimony, or critical methods such as fabulation in Black studies.
Okay, thank you, Ben. This tension between the boundary of fact and fiction is certainly central to this, but I think it's also, can you hear me okay? It's also one of the places where there could be more dialogue, I think, between Black studies and Holocaust studies, and because that tension, I think, is central to sort of both fields and both bodies of literature. And I think perhaps okay. That's working now. Okay. I think, you know, if I could say this, I think Holocaust studies might benefit also from some of the vocabularies and methodologies that have come out of Black studies. I don't always think there's enough, you know, dialogue across those fields. Saidiya Hartman's fabulation, critical fabulation, which you mentioned, is a really good example, very relevant to the kinds of works I was looking at, where she's sort of looking at the sort of challenges around archival silences and the need to turn to speculation and fictional narratives. But the one thing I would say about that strikes me about thinking about her method is that fiction, of course, is what these novelists and visual artists work with, right? They have this poetic license, which is a huge advantage, I think, when confronting a history like this, whereas the scholars kind of struggle to find these alternative methods and experimentation. This is already these tools are available to the novelist already. So I think that's part of why I think we should be looking more at art and paying more attention to art and creative expression. I often feel like I'm in the territory of historians, that the projects that I've worked on often seem to be kind of claimed by the historians, but I really want to make an argument for the centrality of art and literature and the creative imagination, particularly when confronting an archive that is so fragmented and so kind of irreparable. I think that that they really bring methods, you know, creative methods that are kind of necessary when confronting that. The other thing about invention that's really central is also just in the biographies of the figures I was looking at, where you see these. At first, I came across Nassy's story of having invented changed his citizenship, falsified it. And then I started to realize that this was actually a pattern across many of the figures that I was looking at, where they would fictionalize their own biographies in order to survive, in order to navigate this racist landscape that they were kind of struggling to make their way through. So that's another reason why I think fiction writers are well positioned to address this history, because fiction fictional narrative, self-reinvention is so central, and performance and all of that is so central to the biographies of these figures as well.
To get to Nassy, which I had the pleasure of seeing this collection with you at the archive in DC.
You recognize that picture of the storage facility? Oh, no,
yes, no, I did.
Bring them out
yeah, exactly. I recognize that. So you argue in the book that the Nassy collection, and I think a lot of the works you look at, but it starts in the first chapter on the Nassy collection, in its way decolonizes the field of Holocaust memory. At the same time, and which we ourselves encountered there, you expose how the collection's institutional inclusion in Holocaust memory at the USHMM in DC has essentially buried it, right? I mean, the collection hasn't been showed in over 2 decades, probably approaching 3 decades. And its inclusion, therefore, also sort of reproduces certain hierarchies of what constitutes a proper Holocaust memory object and what doesn't. So I was wondering if you could maybe say more about this contradiction, sort of the work that the Nassy collection does on its own for us, but also what happens to it when it is included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I should explain, Ben was part of a seminar that I co-organized with a descendant of Josef Nassy, who's a wonderful scholar named Jacqueline Nassy Brown, at the USHMM in 2023.
Yes, I think so.
Called Black Lives Under Nazism, and it was a very kind of exciting moment to kind of bring this discussion into that space, but also complicated in various ways. Yeah, I mean, again, I think this speaks to a larger pattern that I started to notice with the corpus of works that I found, where this sort of paradox where the history that they're trying to document or recover is an invisibilized one, and at the same time, the works themselves I discovered often had a difficult reception or an ambivalent reception, or had struggled to kind of gain recognition. So there's this kind of double erasure that happens, and the Nassy collection I think is really a key example of that, where there's this large collection of I think these really important and beautiful works, and yet they're quite difficult to access. I struggled for years to kind of gain access to them and permission to photograph them. And so that is a sort of paradox of the inclusion. I think when I looked pretty closely at the institutional archives at the USHMM to try to understand the history of the way in which the works entered into the institution and what happened to them. And I think they entered it at an awkward moment. So they were donated in 1991, which is just before the USHMM opens in Washington. And I think at the time it was difficult for the museum to integrate this collection into the mandate that it had. And you can see in the kind of internal dialogues among the staff how they're struggling with how to position this work that is by a Black artist. It's internment art rather than concentration camp art. They're struggling with these kind of categories. So the timing, I think, is difficult, and then it gets kind of lost. And I think there is I really hope that there will be a new exhibition of his work at some point. I've sort of been trying to make inquiries and work on that. And there was recently a Dutch documentary series that featured Nassy in one of its episodes, so I think his story is starting to circulate a little bit more. But it is this kind of interesting paradox, as you say, that by being included in this Holocaust museum, but not quite fitting the narratives that they want to present at the time, it ends up disappearing.
So, relatedly then, it's somewhat of a similar question, but I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more on how these artistic and literary works relate to categories such as Holocaust art, Holocaust literature, Holocaust testimony, which in the book you make a compelling argument to include them within those categories. So like, how are you thinking about these categories? Because, on the one hand, scholars have shown, for example, Ari Jaskowitz, that, sometimes incorporating minority narratives into Holocaust frameworks can in fact constrain them, because those narratives then are sort of subjected to established archival or interpretive protocols of Holocaust narratives or Holocaust testimony. But on the other hand, you sort of suggest that including these works in Holocaust frameworks does something more complex than just kind of expanding the umbrella, so to speak, and it actually compels us to think about the Holocaust in a more relational way. So do you think it's sometimes more productive, in fact, to expand beyond the framework of the Holocaust rather than subsume the diverse wartime experiences within it, or conversely, what are the gains of bringing these works into the Holocaust categories?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting kind of critiques I've received and made me worried about the most, which is, is it to situate the works in this way, is that sort of reinscribing the sort of necessity that in order for these works to matter, we have to kind of read them within the framework of Holocaust literature or art. I guess my short answer to that would be I think it's not an either or. They can be situated both as works of Holocaust fiction and as jazz fiction, for example, and by framing them in different ways, you highlight sort of different aspects of the works. Another part of this for me is that I think some of the works themselves are trying to position themselves as Holocaust literature or art. So, for example, Michel Maillet's novel L'Étoile Noire, The Black Star, the title itself suggests, a kind of trying to position her fictionalized narrative of Black concentration camp victims in relation to Jewish experience of the Holocaust. So I think in some cases it's interesting to look at how the works are trying to claim a place in canons of Holocaust literature and art, but often not really succeeding. I guess ultimately I think that it's not, as a critic, I'm not really interested in trying to determine is this Holocaust art or not. That's maybe not for me the most interesting question. It's more about the kinds of pressure that these works put on those categories and what they reveal about the ways that we organize canons of Holocaust literature and art in ways that may include or exclude certain perspectives or voices. So I think that, for me, is the most interesting part, is how it exposes those dynamics of canon formation.
Yeah, could you maybe say more about that pressure? I mean, what it does, what it forces us to rethink, perhaps?
Yeah, well, and I think, as you were starting to suggest, it really does push us towards a more relational, connective kind of reading, because these are works that all of them bring together these different histories of violence and oppression and suggest that they're intertwined in various ways. So I think that does kind of put pressure on, I think sometimes when we talk about uniqueness arguments about the Holocaust, but there also are uniqueness claims made about Holocaust literature, that it does certain things that other literatures don't do. I think when we really look closely at I don't want to deny the specificities of these literatures, but when we look at other literatures that have sort of testimonial traditions and deal with trauma in particular ways, I'm not sure that really holds up that kind of exceptionalist narrative. So I think those are the kinds of questions, at least, that these works raise.
So throughout a theme of your talk today, but also in the book itself, is sort of the limits of recuperation, which is not so evident, I think, when you start. I mean, at least for me, when I opened the book, and I was thinking that it would be sort of recuperating all of these experiences for us and excavating them, right? And so I wanted to just maybe ask you more about the limits of recuperation that you yourself encountered with respect to the Williams and Edugen fiction, maybe also give you a chance to speak a little bit more about Valida Snow's complicated biography, and then, of course, the landscapes that we saw. So how did these writers and artists help us think more complexly and challenge our desires to uncover or excavate these minority narratives from and experiences from the past? What kind of questions do they raise for us who are rethinking the field of Holocaust studies in relation to histories of colonialism or histories of racism more broadly?
Yeah, so I think I also maybe started the book thinking that these works were going to be about, satisfying this desire. I think they do, these works make us aware of our own desire, or let's say my own desire, to fill those gaps in the archive, right? To know what were the names of these Black prisoners that Nassy was drawing? Who were they? What were their stories? Trying to recover that information, and that's part of the sort of impulse, I think, that we tend to have when we look at those works or when we read some of these works of fiction, that they're kind of playing with that desire that we have and sometimes seeming to fulfill it. So John A. Williams's novel, Clifford's Blues, for example, is presented as the first-person concentration camp diary of this African-American prisoner at Dachau. And it is, in a sense, that he's sort of giving us this testimony that we can then have access to and kind of open up this story that's otherwise not available. Whereas Edugyan, as I mentioned in the talking, denies us that access to the testimony, and I find that interesting. But for me, the photomontages most profoundly kind of thematize and challenge that, because they're working with photographs which we think are going to give us, evidence of the past. They're going to document this history, this piece of history that's missing. But by combining the different photographic images in the way that she does, she really disrupts that evidentiary power of representation that we associate with photographs. So I think she's really kind of challenging that quite profoundly. Valletta Snow is a whole story unto herself. She was an African-American jazz trumpeter, quite interesting character who was really unusual for her day in terms of gender conventions as well. The ideas about even the fact of being a trumpet player, women were not supposed to be instrumentalists, they were supposed to be vocalists. She was really a kind of extraordinary person. And she performed and worked quite a lot in Europe. She was in Europe when the war broke out. She chose to stay, like some of the other jazz musicians, rather than go back when the American government said you should leave. And she's imprisoned in Denmark. And when she's released and goes back to the US, she's interviewed by the African American press, which is one of the only places where you really find a textual record of these. So I didn't have a chance to mention that, but that's one of the kind of key textual sources. And she says that she's been in a concentration camp and seems to exaggerate as it's emerged, in the work that historians have done since then, seems to have exaggerated the conditions of her imprisonment. It's hard to kind of know how to read that. Is it also the journalists, embellishing for their audiences? Is she strategically embellishing in order to to find some kind of strategic advantage out of that? I came to think of that really in the context of what I mentioned before, of this need for self-invention as a strategy of survival. But she's a particularly complicated figure, but she's the one who generates the most fiction, the most novels. There's musicals about her, short stories. So she, and again, I think this way in which she fictionalizes her own life then kind of lends itself to a fictional treatment by these recent writers. So there's more to say about her, but maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Was going to now open it up to questions from the audience.
I couldn't tell just about how many Black people were involved in what went on in Nazi Germany. Obviously, the far less number of Jews, but so I didn't get a feeling of the scope of how many people were considering, and then also you mentioned that sterilization rather than murder was one of the avenues that the Nazis took to control blacks, and I was wondering whether there's some feeling for the relative importance of these two ways of dealing with the black people who fell under Nazi control.
Okay, thank you. I'll just give the caveat that, again, I'm not a historian, so I can only sort of draw on the work of historians here. And part of the reason I didn't mention numbers is because the historians themselves have really not been able to determine the numbers, partly because part of the problem of the archive is the Nazis did not have a designated category for Black prisoners. When they were imprisoned, sometimes their race was identified in the records, sometimes it wasn't, or misidentified. Sometimes they were categorized under the citizenship of the European colonial power as opposed to the place that they were actually from being named. So the archival records are very problematic and fragmented, and it's very difficult for historians to trace trace numbers for that reason, but I think you're right that it is a much smaller scope, of course, than some of these other victim populations that have been the focus of Holocaust research. I guess the one thing I would say about that, though, is that I think the focus on numbers sometimes can be, is a bit worrying, because even if it was a smaller population, does that mean that it's less interest, right, or less important to tell those stories? So I think I get a little nervous around this. Sometimes we have a bit of a rhetoric of numbers within Holocaust studies. So I think that's one thing to say. Where we do see a much larger scope of Black people impacted by the war, the colonial POWs. There are thousands of Black soldiers who are imprisoned in France, not in Germany, because Germany doesn't want to contaminate German soil with these Black French colonial soldiers. So so Senghor would be the famous example, and he writes these incredible poems while he's imprisoned in a couple of POW camps in France. The historian Raphael Scheck has written about that history. So in that case, there are many thousands. I'm sorry, I can't remember offhand exactly the scope. In terms of forced sterilization versus murder, I think, again, I have to defer to the work of historians. This is particularly talking about Black Germans, which is it's a very complex history, because these different Black populations are treated in different ways, and sometimes it's contingent on all kinds of other factors. Robbie Aitken is the historian whose work on Black Germans I really admire. And I think his work is still ongoing on this, but he has argued that although there wasn't a systematic process, aim of eliminating Black Germans initially, as the war continued, the Nazi regime became more radicalized, and he thinks they were moving more towards a policy of elimination. I think part of the story there is that the Black population was less of a threat partly because they were more identifiable than Jews, so that it was less of a concern because they were hyper-visible, and there was less of a systematic approach to this population because it was smaller than there were to some of the other to Jews and to the Roma and Sinti. There was something else I was but important to note in terms of the history there is that the Nuremberg laws, which are originally designed to facilitate the persecution of Jews, in 1935, a few months later, an addendum is added that expands them to apply to other so-called racial alien groups, the Roma and Black people. So there is a legal structure that facilitates the persecution of Black Germans. Again, the case of Black Germans is different from these other Black populations in occupied Europe.
I have not had the chance to read your book yet, but I would really like to. But I did get the chance to read something else you wrote about an introduction about Holocaust refugees in the colonial world, which is very relevant to me as I'm also looking at this idea of entanglement, but in the context of North Africa. But my question is not related to that, but just as a comment. My question is about one aspect of the title of your book, the Making History Visible. It feels intentional, of course, since it's the title, but also I feel like in history there's like this tendency to use phrases like untold histories, like this emphasis on that, and so I feel like this is different than that, and you're not trying to say that no one knew about this, but you're trying to, I guess, like bring it to the fore. I guess I'm just wondering if you could maybe unpack how you thought about the title, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting question, and I appreciate what you're saying. That also that, if I understood correctly, that. There's sort of a risk of suggesting that these histories were unknown. That's not the case, right? That they're certainly known, for example, within the families, the descendants of, and so the way that I discovered or came across Nassy's story was that Paul Gilroy mentions it very briefly in a book of his, and I later discovered the reason that Paul Gilroy mentions it is because Jackie Nassy Brown, who's the descendant of Josef Nassy, the woman with whom a colleague with whom I organized the seminar that Ben was in, she told Paul Gilroy about her great uncle's story, and that's how it enters his book, and that's how I came across, this couple of lines about him, and then that led me to this. But so it's not that they're unknown, but it's how do they become legible to a kind of wider audience, I guess, is part of the concern. When is it that they're able to enter into legibility in that kind of larger public sphere, and what are the kind of struggles to get to have those stories that are known but are not being necessarily circulated, or the works themselves not being circulated or exhibited and being hidden in storage facilities. So making history visible was, I think, part of this interest in this problem of invisibilization and visibility. I later, after I came up with that phrase, I came across an archive that the artist Lubina Himid has in the UK, which is also called Making History Visible, so I want to acknowledge that. She was Maud Salter's partner as well, so there's a connection to Salter there. But in a way, it's like that phrase, I'm glad that you picked up on it in the way that you did, because it does, it's kind of a double-edged thing, because I'm also arguing, as you saw, that in a way it's not possible to bring these histories fully into visibility.
In terms of the visibility of the paintings, for example, that are in storage down here in Los Angeles, the Holocaust Museum, I think, has tried to generalize the Holocaust to groups other than just the Jews. And there are lots of Holocaust museums around the country. Have you or anybody thought of trying to get these paintings out of storage and have them displayed in something other than the museum in Washington, D.C.?
I really do hope that there will be an exhibition at some point, and again, it's sort of trying to figure out how and where to make that happen. I should say that the USHMM has really liberalized its policy on the digital images, so you can now access them through the catalog much more readily than you could when I was first doing this research. So I'm really happy to note that they have become more accessible in that way. They have occasionally exhibited a work or two, but they haven't been exhibited as a collection. The exhibition they did in '97, as I kind of saw in the archives, they were sort of under pressure from the donor to do something, and it was a fairly small show, I think of 18 works. So I do think it would be very timely for the works to be shown more fully.
Michael.
Thanks. I don't know if this question will speak to you or not, because I don't think you see yourself as primarily someone working in German studies, but Germany is obviously an important context for what you're doing in all sorts of ways. I was just wondering if you had thoughts or knew about how the kind of work you're doing and this kind of stories that you're helping to uncover or put out there in new ways speaks to sort of like Black Germans today. I guess I'm thinking, and debates that are going on in Germany today. Because there's a lot of kind of overlapping stuff, I think, about the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism, which has been a major subject of debate over the last several years, again, publicly. I think if I'm not mistaken, the Stolpersteine that you showed us at the beginning, the most recent ones, are kind of partly the effect, I think, of activism, sort of memory activism, of people trying to make these stories visible in some sense. I don't know, I just wonder, like, is there do you feel like there's a particular resonance to this kind of history and these kinds of fictions for Black German communities?
Yeah, thank you. I think you may be much more qualified to answer that question than I am, but my background, I should say, is in Caribbean studies, so research leads you into areas that you don't expect to go, so I've been sort of trying to grapple. I'm actually teaching a course, a grad seminar on Black Europe right now, and thinking about Black German activism to a certain extent, but more focused sort of in the 1980s moment, when some of the Black German women activists really start to formulate some of their discourse. And the sense I've gotten from some of that work, at least, is that it was really more focused on the present circumstances, although you see, like in Falba Buchanan, there's some of these, Martha Ndumbe, Erica, she's one of the people I think who contributes to that anthology, so there is that connection there. I think I've also thought about it in terms of Germany's sort of more like belated reckoning with its colonial history that I understand to be kind of going on now. And I think that you know, some of my students have said to me in the Black Europe class, like, oh, Germany had colonies? They're very surprised, right, to discover that. And that seems to me part of the obstacle to, like, part of what leads to these histories not being better known, the wartime histories, is that the colonial history is not really being grappled with. And so with that engagement with the colonial history, you also start to understand the presence of these colonial subjects as part of that that dynamic of colonialism. Of course, they're also coming to Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then they're present in Germany when the Nazis come to power, and the Nazis have to sort of decide how to address that population. So I think it's very entangled. In terms of Black German activism now, and how, yeah, I think that's very much part of the renaming of streets and that kind of thing that's going on. Yeah, but you could probably tell me a lot more about that too.
Who would?
Yeah, okay. Two sort of related questions about famously the Nuremberg laws were based on the treatment post-Reformation of a lot of the laws in the South, in the American South. They sent Germans down there. I was wondering if that's reflected in the Nazi. And the other thing is, Susan Sontag wrote a famous piece called "Fascinating Fascism," all about Leni Riefenstahl and her, treatment of Africans later on. This is post World War II. I was wondering if you would reflect on those two things.
Okay. Yeah. The sort of link between Jim Crow and 1930s Nazi Germany is a really interesting one too. The USHMM ran a seminar about that a number of years ago that I participated in, and the sort of influence of one context on the other, and so that's another way of, I think, of exploring these kinds of entanglements and connectivities that we sort of sometimes have overlooked. It's a little outside my expertise in terms of the details of that, and there are other scholars, I think, who have looked at that more closely. In terms of Sontag's essay, Fascinating Fascism, she's looking at Riefenstahl's photography of Africans, right? I guess I would think about that, maybe perhaps in relation to Salter's photomontages that I was showing, which is this sort of the gaze of the filmmaker, of the photographer, and how that can be transposed, from one setting to another would be and so that sort of post-war continuities in her work, I think is partly, if I remember right, is partly what Sontag is pointing to there, that this gaze that she then applies in an African context. So that would again be kind of a way, in terms of like ways of seeing genres of representation, to kind of connect these different historical moments in different contexts, and so that's very much in the spirit of some of what I was trying to do. But I haven't looked closely at the Riefenstahl work.
Quick question. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's a wonderful eye-opener. A quick question about Nassy's Sephardic Jewish half, because it's interesting that he escapes persecution with his Black American provenance, not the one that's more of a handicap for him had that Sephardic Jewish bit come out. And then for Maud Salter, who is half white and half Ghanaian, she embraces the black side of her lesbian feminist provenance. And there's a recuperative project there, but I'm really interested in the Sephardic black. It's weird in the scales that have black people better off than men.
Yes,
in certain situations, because usually you put whiteness in front of blackness, usually.
Right.
And here's a situation where you have a black male person saying, well, look, actually, I'm American, and would you mind taking that as my first thing and forgetting about that thing?
Right.
which is the other side of it. And it's something that Walcott says about the inclusion poet, about being divided to the vein.
Yes.
The impossibility of dividing blood, and therefore the imperative for artists to embrace both as an imaginary.
Yeah. Yeah, Walcott very much embraced that. Yeah, it's fairly counterintuitive, isn't it, that it's by passing as a black man, as an African American, that he is able to survive the war under better conditions, I think, than he would have been otherwise. Again, I think of it in terms of the strategic self-fashioning, that it becomes, and he's not the only one, right? There's lots of this going on in the camps where alongside, and it's not just in terms of passing as a black man, but there are a number of Polish Jews in the same internment camp who are pretending to be Latin Americans. They managed to secure these, papers for Costa Rica and other places, and it's bizarre because I don't think they spoke Spanish. I don't think that the camp authorities really believed them, but apparently they were able to get away with it because the German authorities wanted them for the exchange value with other prisoners of war. So that was, but in other words, this was going on, more broadly in the camp. But of course, Nassy's version of it is quite specific, which is to pass as an African American. On the other hand, there are lots of other black people in Europe who seem to have passed as African Americans too. Because, for example, musicians. There was this desire to, this sort of market for authentic jazz music, and if you could say you were an American, that came off much better as a jazz performer. So he wasn't unique in that. There's another man named Arthur Briggs who was from Grenada, and he also passed as an African American. He was interned during the war as well. He was a jazz trumpeter. So that became kind of an interesting pattern to trace here. But again, also very, as you say, counterintuitive. Nassy's Sephardic history is something that I've looked into a fair bit. That's kind of where I came into this from. My previous book dealt with Jewishness in Caribbean literature and the Sephardic presence in the Caribbean. So when I came across the reference to Nassy in Paul Gilroy's book, I immediately knew from his surname that he had some kind of Sephardic connection, and I knew that Suriname had this deep colonial Jewish history that is complicated in all kinds of ways. I went to Suriname to try to trace Nassy's story there. It was really fascinating to look at some of the genealogical records of his grandmother was enslaved and had the name Nassy, but it was spelled Naasie, which meant that she was an unofficial part of the Nassy family, so an outside, a concubine of a Jewish man. But those stories are, and those histories become deeply intertwined in the Caribbean. And so Nassy's combination of Sephardic Jewish and African ancestry is not unique either. There's certain parts of in Jamaica, you see quite a lot of that, in Curacao, in Suriname. So that's a whole other story again in itself, which I've written about a bit. But I was kind of fascinated by how his biography bridged that Caribbean Jewish story with the wartime European setting. And Salter, as you say, has multiple heritages as well and embraces blackness. Many of the figures, the memoirist Theodor Michael and others, they often have a white German mother and an African father. So that's a kind of characteristic, actually, of many of the figures that I was looking at. But again, I guess I think about this sort of strategic decisions that they make to emphasize certain parts of their identities. Not in the case of Salter, that's a different situation, but in the wartime setting, what makes it possible for them to navigate the situation that they find themselves in.
You mentioned the photograph that you said you had a problem
Yes.
with it. The one that was with, I think it was White or something.
Sorry,
the one that was at the concentration camp.
Yeah.
Johnny Voss, well, not Johnny Voss did it.
Yeah, may or may not be. Here we go.
That one.
Yeah, this photograph, did you want to hear
Yes.
just about this? Yeah, this photograph is often, you'll find it online as, and with the caption, "The Only Black Prisoner in Dachau." And when I first encountered it, it's in the collection of the USHMM, and there was a sort of unambiguous title saying this is this man, Jean Vosté, who was a Congolese-Belgian member of the resistance. There's a researcher in Belgium who has now written a whole book about Vastey and about this photograph, and he's just determined, according to his research, that it's not in fact Jean Vastey, and he's got some arguments about why that's the case. So it's very striking to me that one of the only photographs we have of what appears to be a black prisoner in a concentration camp, which we think is kind of, again, going to provide evidence of this history, turns out to be a very unstable object where we actually don't really know. It's very slippery. We don't know who this individual is. Is it Jean Vastey or not? And that seems to me kind of emblematic of the whole problem of the archive kind of not facilitating our access to this history. So I don't. According to this researcher, it is. I think they've now revised the.
Yeah, it doesn't
right.
say.
They've revised the caption. The USHMN, so it now says it used to be thought that
Right.
it was Jean Vastey, and now it's not. Now we think it's not.
Right, and there's his argument. I mean, is there's other photos of Jean Vastey.
Right. Right.
That are not this man, you know, and so that's kind of the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I mean, I thought about, do I still use this photograph or not? But in a way, it's the instability of this record that I think the photograph points to in an interesting way. So I've kind of held on to it, I guess, for that reason.
Yeah.
But this photograph, you'll find it in lots of websites and things online as like this is an unambiguous record of this history, and in fact, it turns out to be much more complicated.
Did they say that there's survivors that said that there were black people?
Yes.
at the camps?
Yes, I mean, I think that's not contested. I mean, that's clear. But the question of who this specific individual was is.
This is, I believe, it's a U.S. military photographer's photograph, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.